is David Johnston, and I am Executive Director of Exploring the Metropolis. Exploring the Metropolis has been around since 1982. We started as a neutral nonprofit facilitator, working in issues of upzoning in the theater district, studying things like that. Starting in the year 2000, we started an ongoing workspace program for performing artists, which was a website which matched available space with artists who were looking to rehearse and perform in New York City. This became NYC Performing Arts Spaces, which is now operated by Fractured Atlas. We ran that until 2008, at which point we transferred it to Fractured Atlas. Also in that decade, we did several studies which had very nice impacts. We did a study on the need for rehearsal space for mid-sized symphony orchestras in NYC. That study led to the opening of the Domena Center on West 37th Street, which, if you have gotten a chance to go there, is a really beautiful space. We also did a study for the Mellon Foundation on the workspace issues of mid-career single choreographer-led dance companies. It took me months to be able to say that without tripping over it. That report was released several years ago, and I'm very happy to report that a lot of those recommendations have been taken up. Most recently, the CUNY Dance Initiative, which was a recommendation which came directly from that report, and that's a really terrific partnership between CUNY and various artists, and we'll talk about that a little later on. About a little over a year ago, we embarked on this particular project, the Queens Workspace Initiative, which was the very first borough-specific study we had ever done. We'd always looked very much at specific artists at a stage in their careers, but never an entire borough. This started because we have run a residency program for several years, ATM Con Edison Composer's Residency, and that's starting on its 6th year right now. And we noticed over the period of several years, we have facilities in Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn, but we noticed the quality of the Queens composers was really high. According to our panels, they were scoring very, very high just on straight artistic merit. And so when we looked at this, we saw that there were so many really good young artists who were moving into Queens because they've been priced out of Brooklyn at this point. 10 years ago, everybody was priced out of the Lower East Side. Now they're priced out of Williamsburg and Bushwick. So we started meeting with various officials, stakeholders, artists, facilities in Queens to say, where can we find this data on whether or not performing artists' workspace needs are being met in Queens? And everybody said, we don't have any. We don't have any data. We'd really like it if somebody would do that. So we put this proposal together, and we went to several funders, and we said, this is what we'd like to do. We want to see if performing artists' workspace issues are being met within this borough. And if not, how can we help to grow those opportunities? Because there seems like a huge amount of really great artistic work going on in this borough. And how can we help that along? How can we make that even better for everybody? So that was what became the Queens Workspace Initiative, which has been funded by Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Foundation, the David Rockefeller Fund, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. We have a slide for them later on, so we'll officially acknowledge them. So the only other thing I wanted to mention was our title. The title of the report is, I want to do more than survive, I want to thrive. And this was actually something one of the artists said to us in one of our artist focus groups last fall, which Hillary wrote down, and we really liked that, and then months later we decided that worked as a title because it sort of sounded like what everybody was saying that we talked about here. So, my fantastic consultant on this project, Prentice Onioni, who has just finished his MBA at Columbia, and
Congratulations.
which I hear is a very good school. And he will be picking up the next part of this.
All right, so we're going to chat quite a bit about Queens today. And before we do, we wanted to just give a sense, a little overview of the way that we'll be chatting about Queens and some of the ways that we've broken up our data, just so that there's some sense of us as we're going through. So first and foremost, we're focusing solely on the performing arts for our study within the borough. And there are 96 arts nonprofits, performing arts nonprofits here in the borough. And that's about 1 for every 25,000 residents in Queens. And then you can compare that to Brooklyn, where it's 1 for every 9,500. And then in Manhattan, there's 1 performing arts nonprofit for every 600 residents. Queens in general has the youngest organizations. The oldest non-member organization, like a member organization would be like a society of composers where they get together and chit-chat. But the oldest, like, brick and mortar organization is Queens Symphony Orchestra at 61 years. And you can compare that to a band that is 153 years old. And then also out of the CIGs, I'm sure that that's terminology that most of you are familiar with, the cultural institutions group. There are 33 institutions. I think there are 8 here in Queens. The members of the cultural institutions group that are here in Queens do get the lowest amount of funding per capita at $1.05. It's almost half of the person who's in 4th place, I guess. So in general, we'll talk quite a bit about regional differences, and so we wanted you to take a look at the way that we are splitting up the borough. In the Northwest, you've got Long Island City, Astoria. Generally, our borders run along the major highways, and then that's Flushing Meadows from the park there in the middle that we used to split it. Northeast, you've got Flushing and the like. Southwest, your Ridgewoods, I think it's over there bordering Brooklyn, and then also the Rockaways, and then Southeast, where we are now, Jamaica, Greater Jamaica area.
An overview of the project, and this is something historically we've done at Exploring the Metropolis. We have an initial period of discovery. We want to just gather all of the data that we can. We have a second phase of vetting, going through it, talking to everybody, saying, what do you think of this, what do you think of that, trying to put it all together and draw some conclusions. The third being the pilot programs and the assessment. And what we want to do with the pilot programs and then the assessment or an evaluation is then take the data from that evaluation and put it back into the beginning, back into the discovery phase, so that we're constantly adding to our data of what we know about these situations and how we're trying to assess and deal with them. So this is just a breakdown of how we structured the project. First, the steering committee, which helped us get to the focus groups, who helped us refine the surveys, and then the preliminary findings, then the interviews, and I'll be going into all these capsules in a little more detail. And then when we get to the end, we'll talk more about the pilot programs. The pilot programs, where we would like to go with those, and the ultimate assessment. Steering. I'm happy to say there are several members of our steering committee here. They were really the first phase of our work with this, and we really wanted to find the people who had the expertise in space issues, and also the ones who had the expertise in Queens arts issues. So this was the first thing we did, was to really assemble this group so that they could help us with recommendations, issues, who should participate in the focus group, who are the ones we need to be talking to. This group was very, very important to get us started on this. And please thank all for it. The focus groups. The steering committee helped us to nominate and select a lot of the people who would then be in the focus groups. We had 2 focus groups, one for artists and one for facilities. The one for artists we had at the Queens Council on the Arts. The the one for facilities and policymakers we had here, and we did all that last September. A big thing of what we wanted to bring the focus groups together for was Prentice and I had been drafting these surveys that would go out to the artists and to the facilities, and we wanted to put it in front of these focus groups and say, how is this? Does this stink? What did we miss? What are the issues we're not hitting? What's important to you? What can we get rid of? But we really felt with this project that it was so important at every point to check in with the people who it was affecting as much as we could. So these were our focus groups. We had a really terrific bunch of artists, and dancers, composers, actors, choreographers, and some playwrights, jazz musicians, for the facilities and policymakers. And I think a couple of you were here at that. We had people from elected officials' office, funders, arts service organizations, in addition to the CIG's facilities like the Chocolate Factory, and also historical societies, historic houses. The survey disseminators. Once we have the surveys together, we wanted to gather everybody we could to get the survey out to as wide a pool as we possibly could. So these were, and I think this is a complete list. This is the complete one that's at the back of the appendix in the report. But it was mostly broken down into art service organizations, groups like Art New York, Chamber Music America, Dance NYC, elected officials, particularly at the local level here in Queens. And also we found the local blogs were really helpful in getting this out. Mission to Ditmar, We Heart Astoria, and Why Leave Astoria were really terrific at sending those things out as much as they could.
All right, so I'll walk us through a little bit of our preliminary findings on the survey that we ran. So the artists first. We had roughly an even mix of music versus theater practitioners. Dance was third, and then other, and that was folk and traditional artists, and multidisciplinary and performance art. All of these categories are what the artists themselves self-identify as. We had a nice mix of gender, like male, female. And what we did notice, though, was that the vast majority of our respondents were from Northwestern Queens. Of our 132 respondents, 121 of them were from Northwestern Queens. We had 7 from Northeastern, 3 from Southeastern, and 1 from Southwestern. And so, we would ask ourselves the question, like, what exactly does that mean? We know that there are many more organizations concentrated in Northwestern Queens, and then also that's also the initial hub that many artists move to. But there are a number of issues that we'll talk about later on that we think led to this kind of response rate. 68% of our respondents were white, and then you can see the breakdown there of the other races, and we had a nice bell curve when it came to ages. So some key findings. Something that was interesting was that we noticed that dancers and theater practitioners were almost uniformly only willing to pay $20 or less for rehearsal space. 93% of dancers and 90% of theater practitioners. And we'll come back to this in a moment once we compare that to the facilities data. Another thing that we noticed qualitatively with the surveys was a desire for better quality and more pianos, both for rehearsal and performance purposes, especially within Northwestern Queens. And then a third thing was that the artists in Queens love Queens. They're not here just because they want to have cheaper rent and then go and rehearse and perform in Manhattan. 78% of artists said that they wanted to rehearse and perform more in their neighborhoods.
I just can't resist asking, did anybody differentiate between actual acoustic pianos and electronic pianos? It's just such a big, expensive piece of equipment, and I think a lot of spaces could make electronic equipment available.
Specifically, the musicians that we surveyed want not uprights, but proper baby grand pianos for performance purposes, because
For performance, I understand.
Yeah, that's the big thing that's lacking in the area.
But for rehearsal, did they?
I think.
Like if there's a dance company that wanted a live accompanist for. I'm probably taking you way off track. Never mind. Please continue.
But that's good. We can, I mean, put a peg there and we can talk about that at the end because I have something there. So, okay.
It's ironic in Queens.
Right.
Given the presence of Steinway.
Yeah. Right.
So on the facilities side, we noticed that there was like music, dance, and theater were the biggest genres that were presented by these facilities. And then there was roughly a fairly even mix of other performing arts disciplines that we identified. Here, again, the vast majority of the spaces were in northwestern Queens. Out of the 32 respondents, 12 of them were in Northwestern. We had 5 in Northeastern, 6 in Southeastern, and then none in Southwestern. And so it's interesting to see that here, especially here in the Southeast, there are a number of organizations, but then we didn't get the same turnout with the artists themselves. So that speaks to maybe there's some kind of disconnect there, but we'll get to that in a bit. On the bottom left there, that bar chart is the number of performances that they host a year, so that was quite diverse there too. And then we had a decent smattering of different budget sizes that were taken into account. So our key findings here were that we already talked about how the vast, like 93% of dancers, 90% of theater practitioners were only willing to spend $20 or more or less on rehearsal space. And then we noticed that only 54% of dance spaces and less than 30% of theater spaces were charging $20 or less for rehearsal rentals. So there may be some disconnect there in terms of how much artists are willing to pay and how much the facilities are charging. There could be a number of reasons for that. Maybe the cost of keeping the doors open exceeds $20, and so there's no way that the facilities can. But if this is space that's just sitting there empty, and they're already running the lights and the utilities, then reducing that price may help to boost revenues. Another thing that we noticed was that more than 70% of these theater practitioners want to rehearse on weekend afternoons, but less than half of the facilities are available for rentals at that time. And it's possible that they're running their own matinee performances and thus they aren't available, but it does speak to a potential need that exists here in the borough. And then finally, there were significant differences, especially when we looked at revenue and fundraising, the makeup of their fundraising base from region to region. And then we'll get back to that shortly. Pass it to David, and he'll talk about some of the more qualitative information that we brought into the initiative.
And just to piggyback on one of the things Prentice said, one of the things we discovered from the Mellon study we did on dance a couple of years ago was dancers do need space for longer, they have more space requirements, and they can pay less than anybody else. So it sort of fell in line with a lot of the current research that dancers could only pay X amount of money and that they really couldn't pay much more than that. Also, we did find that the income that we surveyed for the artists was very much in line with all of the recent arts research of the last decade, which is basically artists have no money, but we know that. The interviewees, yes. Yeah, we interviewed a lot of people. This was starting from April of last year and going on to April of this year, actually February of last year. So we did, again, elected officials, historic houses, arts groups, individual artists, CIGs, cultural facilities, board members of major organizations, artists who were also working as community board members who wanted to try to bring the arts more into their areas. And this was really, I think we thought that the surveys were where we were going to get the meat of our data that we were going to be working with, but it actually turned out to be the qualitative data instead. It was really the interviews that shaped a lot of what we found in a lot of what we put together. And people were so responsive. It was great. We've done a number of these surveys, and to have people immediately say, yes, we want to talk to you, yes, when can we meet? No, nobody's doing this kind of work out there, nobody's done it before, we really need it done. And that was a great thing about this particular project as we were working on it. Oh, the CDP. We were working with a number of external data sets to try to give context to this project. Data from the Furman Center at the Wagner School at NYU, data from NYC Performing Arts Spaces to give us an idea of what were the spaces that were available, data from the Cultural Data Project. There's another one here, I can't remember. The Cultural Data Project, okay. Who here is familiar with the Cultural Data Project? Okay. I've had to fill it out for years for my organization. It's an enormous pain. I have griped and complained about it for years to whoever would listen. We went to the CDP people this year, we told them about what we were doing. We said we would like some data. They gave us exactly the data we wanted. And I have to admit, it was really good data. It was really good. As much as I bitched and moaned about filling out that thing for 5-6 years, the data that we got back from them was very revealing, particularly going into the regional differences in Queens. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Cultural Data Project, it started several years ago. Basically, if you are an arts organization in New York State and you are seeking public funding from the state, the city, or any other agency, you have to fill out a Cultural Data Project profile, which goes into very in-depth into your revenue, into your finances, into your board, into your activities. It's extensive. And if you are seeking public funding, you must fill it out. It's a requirement. We were aware, looking at this, that there are tons of groups that are not getting this kind of funding and that are sort of out of this, they're sort of off of this funding grid. Taking that into consideration, the CDP data was still really good. It was better than anything else we were looking at in terms of really getting some real detailed information on how these cultural organizations are keeping their own revenues afloat.
So first, CDP only addresses organizations that are typically vying for public funding. It's people who are applying to NISCA and DCA. And then because of the differences in the way that people the organizations mark their fiscal years, we use the organizations that submitted data for a fiscal year in the 12 months preceding the point when we received the data drop. Now, what was interesting here was that the balance of the number of organizations was relatively even with the information that we got from our surveys. We saw that we had the vast majority of organizations, 28 of the 47 were in Northwestern Queens. Northeast and Southeastern had roughly the same amount at 8 and 9, so like the high teens in terms of percentage, and then 2 organizations in Southwestern Queens. Something that was very interesting was that we looked at the age of the organizations, and not surprisingly, Northwestern Queens, having many more organizations, also had the youngest average age. Northeastern Queens had the oldest organizations by far, with 43 years on average. Southeastern was 26, and then Southwestern was 34. So, the most interesting information that we got from this was the makeup of fundraising, of the fundraising side of these organizations when it came to how they were building that side of their budget. So what we noticed was that board support varied widely from one region to the next. In Southeastern and Southwestern Queens, the average board member per year contributed $175 to the organization on whose board they were sitting. And if you compare that to northeastern Queens, the average there was like $1,400 per year, and then in northwestern Queens, $6,700 per year per member. Looking at individual donations, northwestern Queens led the pack with 8.5 times the annual amount of individual donations that southeastern Queens got. Foundation support was similar, with southwestern Queens getting 12.5 times more foundation support than southeastern Queens. When it came to corporate support, northwestern Queens was at the top there too, with 32 times the amount of corporate support than there is in southeastern Queens. And then, not surprisingly, southeastern Queens organizations are heavily reliant on public support. It makes up, on average, 86% of their budgets. So, after doing our surveys and then having a host of interviews, looking at CDP data and other external data sets, we basically honed everything down to a few key points when it comes to opportunities and challenges here in the borough. On the opportunity side, Queens has some really, really strong arts leaders. And it seems as though Queens-based organizations are places where young arts leaders can come and cut their teeth and have a substantive impact here in the borough. I'm not going to name names, but there are a number of leaders who have just, within a very concentrated period of time, done these turnarounds of organizations and have really put them on a map in a way that they weren't previously. Another thing that's really great for Queens right now is that the political climate is perfect. You've got a borough president whose mother founded Queens Council on the Arts and father founded Queens Symphony Orchestra. Jimmy Van Bramer is the chair of the Cultural Affairs Committee for the City Council. Tom Finkelpearl is now the commissioner for DCA. And then when it comes to areas where the city and the mayor's office is looking to develop, Queens is there. Alicia Glenn is on board. The New York City Economic Development Corporation is on board. The Regional Plan Association is on board. Everyone's looking to Queens. So the political climate honestly couldn't be better for Queens to just take off. On the challenges side, there are many isolated communities. There are over 132 different languages that are spoken here in the borough. You have in Jackson Heights, an area where within 3 blocks, there are 51 languages that are spoken. And so it becomes quite difficult to, imagine trying to curate theatrical programming for an audience that's speaking 51 languages. It just poses considerable challenges. It poses considerable challenges when one is coming to the table as a performing arts organization. The other thing is that the philanthropic infrastructure of Queens just isn't as developed as it is in Manhattan or even in Brooklyn. And I think that there are a host of reasons for it, and maybe the philanthropy isn't as sexy in the same way. There isn't the same concentration of high net worth people who are looking to the arts as a way for them to have a substantive impact on the community. Also, when looking at the way that communities function, because there are so many different cultural silos, that also likely has an impact on the amount of funding that organizations are able to receive from or to compete for within their communities. So from here, we took that and then looked at a few regional conclusions. So in northwestern Queens, they are by and large well on their way to quite a thriving performing arts landscape. They have a good number of organizations. They are well supported when it comes to, when you look at the way that their revenue mix is coming in. People are generally on board. They have participatory boards. The individuals are donating. The corporations are down. The foundations are at the table. And it looks like their journey is already in process for them to, they're basically the banner carrier, if you will, for the borough. Looking at northeastern Queens, we think that that's an area that would be ripe for the research, because we didn't get that much information from northeastern Queens, but we think that it's likely due to the fact that that's the region that has by far the most cultural diversity. And so, lots of times people will talk about how in northwestern Queens, that's where all the property boom is and the like, but the rest of the real estate prices in Flushing were actually those that rose the highest from 2012 to 2013. So there's a lot of economic development that's happening there, but for some reason it's not necessarily translating to the performing arts and culture communities. But maybe that's something that can be well researched by an organization that has greater capacity to interface with the many different communities that are there. In southwestern Queens, we just didn't have enough information because of the small number of artists, small number of facilities that we engaged, and then that we were able to engage, and then also the small number of people that we were able to get on the phone or get in front of face to face. And then here in southeastern Queens, there's tremendous growth potential. So looking at what we think could be interesting borough-wide, this question of rehearsal space and pricing and utilization is something that could be an interesting path forward. So in general, facilities reported that of the available rental time that they had, they weren't being very well utilized. And if you look at the report, you can see all of the numbers for each different discipline. But then, because of the disconnect that we saw when it comes to the amount that artists are willing to pay versus how much facilities are charging, they could simply be overpricing. So some solutions for that could be subsidies, either directly to the facilities, or you could go the artist route, you could have sponsorship that gets layered in there, or coming up with some lower cost alternatives if it turns out that the reason why facilities aren't able to offer their spaces at a price that artists can afford is because the cost to keep them open is too high. And then the second thing that we could look at borough-wide is this pianos piece, and as Andy mentioned, it is quite telling, or it's quite interesting that one of the nation's most prestigious piano makers is also within the region that specifically highlighted the greatest need for better quality and more pianos. So some solutions there could be potentially seeing if a piano maker might be willing to offer discounts on most of the costs, looking at low-cost financing that could be provided. Also, there are financial institutions that are also in that same region, and there's potential for them to use some CRA money for that, or looking at direct subsidies. And then specifically in southeastern Queens, when we talk about the opportunity for growth, Jamaica quickly jumped out to us as the most fascinating and promising space to invest energy and resources. And the cool thing about Jamaica is that here, everyone is at the table. City government, borough leaders, local government, the private developers with the RPA, they're on board, local arts advocates. There seems to be all kinds of activity around what Jamaica's growth story could potentially look like. And so it's great that these conversations are being had. Jamaica also has the advantage of being a key transit hub. We're talking like 260,000 commuters every day. I'm sure that this is information that many of you all know already. There are 150,000 workers that are just here within the downtown Jamaica area. And then they're 20 minutes away from Penn Station, Atlantic Terminal, and then Grand Central once they do the East Side Access Project. And then, of course, with the rezoning that happened back in 2007, it created space for an additional 5,000 units of housing, 1.8 million square feet of office space, 2 million of commercial space, and then a couple of thousand, 1,000 to 2,000 hotel rooms. So what we thought would be interesting to consider moving forward with Jamaica is, first, cultural leadership development. There are great leaders here, but it seems as though they need support in order to beef up their organizational capacity and their leadership capacity. So that's looking at how they can be more efficient with the resources that they have access to at the moment, and then also how they can best prepare themselves for growing their organizations in whatever way that needs to look like for that specific organization. So there are a few options there. Like there are programs like DCA's program where
which is the capacity building for community-based arts organizations with a budget under 500K.
So there is an existing program that engages local arts leaders in order to help them develop that capacity. And we think that that's a great start, but also there could be something to mentorship around having specific support when it comes to the key strategic decisions that leaders need to make for their specific organizations. And building this cohort of local leaders and having the sense of there being a group that is on this upward trajectory could potentially lead to greater results when it comes to looking at how one can potentially balance out some of these revenues